Welcome to Forward in Time, Sol LeWitt and Contemporary Art. My name is Dr. Niall Blunt, and I am the McPherson Director of Academic Programs here at the Moore Art Gallery and a Professor of Curatorial Practice at the University of Rochester. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's talk, which promises to offer riveting context for one of MAG's newest and most exciting acquisitions, wall drawing number 957, form derived from a cube by Sol LeWitt, which is currently installed in the Vandenbroek Pavilion. This evening's program is made possible by the Vincent and Maria A. Polidoro Fund, with additional support from the Elizabeth L. and Donald M. Cohn Endowment Fund, as well as the hard work of a number of MAG staff, especially Chio Uyama, who expertly manages all the public programming for the Department of Academic Programs. I wish to also extend gratitude to the generous anonymous donor who recently gifted this wall drawing to MAG. In my opinion, and indeed in the opinions of many, there is no better person equipped to offer a talk about the work and legacy of Sol LeWitt than our presenter this evening. John Hogan currently serves as the Mary Jo and Ted Shen Installation Director and Archivist for Sol LeWitt Wall Drawings at the Yale University Art Gallery, a unique position established in 2013 that facilitates collaboration among conservators, curators, and artists. Hogan has been a principal draftsperson for the artist and later his estate since 1982. In this role, he has directed LeWitt wall drawing installations both in the United States and across the globe, including the U.S. Mission to the United Nations, museums and private collections throughout this country and Europe, and most recently the very first LeWitt exhibition in Shanghai, China. We are honored and delighted to hear from such a key figure, both in the life and legacy of LeWitt and within the world of conceptual art. Please join me in welcoming John Hogan.
Well, thank you all for coming. I came to know Sol LeWitt in the 70s when I was a graduate student in Chicago. And when I moved to New York, we were neighbors. And subsequently, I became good friends with him. And over the years, we just sort of casually spent time together and talked about art and go to dinner and things such as that. And at one point, Sol said, I need help on a big piece. Are you willing to help me out a little bit? So here we are, some 40-odd years later. He's gone, and I'm still here and still trying to do my best to represent his work and make sure that it continues to go forward in time and it's properly installed by whole new generations of artists who have come to deal with and accept the tasks that they are charged with to install the work properly, to understand the work and to bring it always to new audiences. So I'm quite excited that it's drawing 957 is now here in MAG. It's a first, and it's an extraordinary piece. It also is a piece that is something that LeWitt was always revisiting new ideas, things that he thought about in the early 70s and then later on started to rethink how might I bring something more to the concept of the work. So in his lifetime, LeWitt created roughly 1,353 wall drawings between 1968 and 2007. When we did the research for the catalog raisonné, there were some drawings that necessarily hadn't been properly documented because he was always interested in simply installing. When he was given an opportunity to be in an exhibition, he didn't want to do something he had already done. So it was always a new opportunity to install a new work. So it meant curators and exhibition venues were really willing to take a chance on the unknown. So if you're a painter or a sculptor or whatever your venue is, you produce objects in your studio, and ultimately they have a history and people know what they look like. So suddenly here's this artist who says, well, I need a big wall and I'll do something new. And for a lot of curators, that's a pretty risky proposition. So in 1968, in October of 1968, LeWitt created his first wall drawing at Paula Cooper Gallery, part of a benefit for the Student Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam. So previous to 1968, LeWitt was doing works on paper, creating structure pieces, as he referred to them, from the late 60s to early 60s on. But his first wall drawing he created at Paula Cooper in October of '68. Paul has asked me for a piece, Sol said. Yes, I want to do something drawings on the wall. So this was a way of doing something that, to me, is two-dimensional as possible. I had thought of for quite a while some time before, and I remember talking to Judd about it, saying, well, what the hell, why not? Coming from the idea of simplicity and of form and complexity and context, this was the first wall drawing that I did. What was slightly later, in a later time, referred to as a serial project. But at the same ideas in terms of doing things flat on the wall. Painting, for instance, isn't flat. It's done on a canvas. The canvas is on a stretcher, and the stretcher is on the wall. So you're really working with three-dimensional objects. So get down to basics. In terms of two-dimensional art, you have to do something directly on the wall with no intervention. That happened to coincide with the time that I was doing these things in series. So this is wall drawing number one. It's graphite. It's drawn similar to the piece that is in the lobby. It's 6H graphite. The lines are roughly 2.5 millimeters apart. It's drawn by hand. The initial drawing Sol did himself, one line at a time. The squares are roughly 4 foot, and although the images, you can somewhat read it, I mean, also this is one of the aspects of LeWitt's early work, because it was all done in graphite and done directly on the wall. They became very difficult to photograph. So they often were, when people would refer to the work critically, they'd say they almost look like veils. They look like lace against the wall. So LeWitt basically decided that he needed to have a system. He was facing the idea of, I'm going to create these works, and they're based on a structure. The wall drawings that use graphite and that are done in this manner are referred to as drawing series, and they're based on combinations of lines in 4 directions. So this is essentially a codex for the work. At the bottom you see 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it indicates the direction the pencil line was to be drawn. And in the top is simply the number representing what those lines would be in those boxes. So LeWitt, even from the very onset, was only thinking without making maquettes. He was going to make wall drawings, and he thought in black and white. He simply made these plans. So in 1741, Bach composed the Goldberg Variations. At least that's when it was first published, from all that I can figure out. So if there's musicians in the room, maybe you can read the notes. And maybe if you're really a good musician, you might even have an idea of what it might sound like. So LeWitt is also working in a very similar manner. He thinks of himself as a composer. So this is 1741. So, 1955 is when that recording was made. How would Bach even have a clue what it was going to sound like? What did Bach think it was going to sound like? LeWitt was facing some of the same kinds of ideas. He wanted to create artworks that were ephemeral in nature, but could always be considered contemporary. So he said, I have to have a structure in place of how the work is defined, how it can go forward in time. He immediately made a decision in the early 70s, 71, 72, where he stopped physically doing the drawings himself, because he said the underlying issue is it's a concept. Every artist who produces anything, it doesn't matter what it is what the material is that they work with, their first decision is, what am I going to do? LeWitt said, ultimately, that's what the work is. Getting it done is the labor of getting it done. It's a different set of issues, and yes, of course, is the notion of the handwork, but LeWitt was saying, yes, there's always the hand involved, but if I want my work to continue in time and to maintain the verity and the truth of the idea of concept, then it has to be something that is repeatable. This is also at a period in time when, in the 60s, when artists were starting to do more and more ephemeral works. So, such as Joan Lyons here, working with visual studies, producing books. Sol was also producing books. He was producing books. He was one of the founders of Printed Matter with Lucy Lepard. And he loved the idea that you could transport art across time and place without a crate, without a big insurance investigations or truckers or art handlers, that you literally could send his plan for a drawing via fax, which is often how he did it, to a place on the other side of the globe that he had never even been to. So, 1968, this exhibition comes to an end. Paula Cooper says, well, Sol, it's drawn on the wall, what am I going to do now? And he was like, well, just paint it out. And that's the verity of the wall drawings. They're repeatable. They're a structure. There's a system in place. They can always be redone. They will always be contemporary. He had no way to know what size wall his work might go on, or where it might go, or even if it was in a place that he had never even heard of. So how do you make an artwork that's drawn directly on the wall, that is in a place and a dimension that you have no idea about? So again, this is where the curator's trust is extraordinary. So at this point in time, Sol said, yes, I need people who understand the work, I need people to install it, and I want them to to ultimately have a sense of the skills that are involved in doing the drawings, but also to have a responsibility to make it a democratic hand. So these are, anything that I basically read are all things from Sol's writings. So at this point in time, already in the 60s, late and early 70s, he's being questioned constantly by critics saying, so you buy the artwork and you don't get anything except the description of it, and somebody else has to do it, So he was on a regular basis being interviewed and asked to really sort of not make necessarily a manifesto that defended his work, but also basically to explain the underlying concepts. So this is what he wrote in 1970, so 2 years after the first wall drawing. The draftsman and the wall enter a dialogue. The draftsman becomes bored, but later, through this meaningless activity, finds peace or misery. The lines on the wall are the residue of this process. The line is as important as the other line. All the lines become one thing. The viewer of the lines can see only lines on the wall. They are meaningless. That is art. So, already LeWitt he's suddenly been given an opportunity to play with other things, other possibilities. How do you explore risk? Where do you find randomness? So this is a wall drawing that is a little bit more about the drafters. So he's trying to make an intellectual point about the underlying concept of the work. So this drawing is 730, it's the Zug Mountains. And basically, as the text says, using a black marker, the drafter draws the outline of the Zug Mountains. The second drafter tries to copy it using a red marker. The third drafter does the same using a blue marker, then the second drafter followed by the third. So it's visual telephone. Sol sent this simply as a typed fax to this exhibition venue. There was no other information, simply a paragraph. So you think, that it was in Zug and it was done, essentially it was part of a concert series, and they asked the local musicians that were performing in the concert series to install the work. So it seems like it's a pretty simple idea. But there's no way to know. So the top line is drawn in black, and it represents the outline of the Zug Mountains in the background from where the exhibition was. But the subsequent lines where people were following it, again, to the skill of the musicians that perform the work, the same way as I mentioned before, Bach had no idea who was going to perform his work 100 years later, or 200 years later, or 300 years later. And LeWitt was still playing with that. So here's a close-up of what that means. There was no way for LeWitt to predict where it would go, but he trusted the underlying idea of the work. Wall drawing. So in 1971, this is a series of different texts that he wrote. The artist conceives of the plans for the wall drawing. It is realized by the draftsman. The artist can be the draftsman. The plan, written, spoken, or drawing, is interpreted by the draftsman. There are decisions the draftsman makes within the plan as part of the plan. Each individual being unique, given the same instructions, would carry them out differently. He would understand them differently. The artist must allow various interpretations of his plan. The draftsman perceives the artist's plan, then reorders it using his own experience and understanding. So basically, LeWitt is saying, if you understand my work, you also have to understand the notion of how these people who are extolling the work function. So later on, Sol notoriously did a series of writings called Paragraphs on Conceptual Art, and this is also a sort of a shortened version of it. It's Sentences on Conceptual Art, and I've only want to point out a few of them just because I think they're sort of particular interest. Conceptual artists are mystics rather than rationalists. They leap to conclusions that logic cannot reach. Rational judgments repeat rational judgments. Irrational judgments lead to new experience. Ideas can be works of art, but they are in a chain of development that may eventually find some form. All ideas need not be made physical. Ideas do not necessarily proceed in a logical order. I think that this is a really important aspect of LeWitt's work. They may set off one unexpected direction, but an idea must necessarily be completed in the mind before the next one is formed. Since no form is intrinsically superior to another, the artist must use any form from any expression of words, written, spoken, or physical reality or equally. And once the idea of the piece is established in the artist's mind and the final form is decided, the process is carried out blindly. There are many side effects that the artist cannot imagine, again, to the point where it's on a wall that he has no idea what it looks like. They may be used as ideas for new works. The process is mechanical and should not be tampered with. It should run its course. And banal ideas cannot be rescued by beautiful execution. And it is difficult to bungle a good idea. So in 2002, LeWitt his work had evolved drastically. But he revisited all the original pencil drawings and said, oh, I should have tried to do that drawing in color. So again, he's brought so this is exactly the same order of wall drawing number 1, except he's replaced the graphite with lines of red, yellow, blue, and graphite. And this is the result. And when he created these new works, people who owned the original drawings, he sent the certificates for the new works, saying, this is actually part of the work that I did 30-some years ago, but I didn't think of it at the time. So here's an example of wall drawing 1, both 1 and the second drawing in color as it installed in 2010. So in the early 80s, around 83, 84, LeWitt started working with colored inks, basically with architectural drawing inks. And so, again, he's revisiting this original drawing of things in a square. And simply he's assigning values of 1, 2, 3, and 4. So again, he's just going, return to the lines in 4 directions yet just in a different material. And then he started working with colored inks. So he returned to the idea. So those ideas that were very seminal at the very beginning get refed, reconstituted, reworked with whole new materials and bringing, even though they are basically the same schematically, they are drastically different visually. So LeWitt's career essentially began as somebody who was doing structure pieces. So he'd been doing the wall drawings, and they were all, as I initially read, about something being two-dimensional. And suddenly he started to rethink that as an idea because he had been working also created these objects that he referred to as structures. So he was like, oh, maybe there's a possibility to create artworks on the wall that have some other aspects to them. So this is how he approached the initial, again, taking the notion of lines in four directions, bringing the ink process to it, and then ultimately creating essentially three-dimensional objects by simply drawing them. So while this was all going on, LeWitt was also doing works on paper. So this is an example of this also gives you a clue on how some of these forms are conceived. They're all based on a grid, connecting different points on the grid. So that's also an underlying aspect of all the other wall drawings, because it allows for them to be expanded or contracted proportionately based on the grid. So in 1991, here is a three-dimensional object, a form, that is, again, based on tonalities of 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the lightest plane, which is in the foreground, here is a 1, 2, 3, 4. So again, very simple, repeatable concept. Which brings us now to wall drawing 957. It was first executed at the Whitney in 2000 as part of at the Whitney Museum of American Art. It presents two isometric forms derived from a cube. These forms are rendered isometrically, a method that LeWitt began to experiment with in the early 80s, angled towards the viewer. The irregular cube forms imply volume but do not suggest any kind of spatial recession. They're not essentially in a landscape, they just simply are free-floating. Maintaining the two-dimensionality of the wall's flat surface plane, drawn in black pencil, wall drawing 957 employs the four basic directions of lines: horizontal, vertical, diagonal left, diagonal right. The four absolute lines are superimposed sequentially, depicting their single, double, triple, and quadruple combinations, thus resulting in 4 degrees of density that delineate the forms in their cubic forms. So again, just lines in 4 directions, now applied to a figure that has volume. This drawing was done as part of the Sol's retrospective that started out in San Francisco at SF MoMA in 1999. And each of the venues, he did one new work. It was a moment where he sort of revisited a lot of the drawings. So it was like, oh, I forgot about this and I forgot about that. And he said, oh, I should really make a new, because again, he really hated the idea of just showing a work that he already knew what it looked like. He relished the idea of making a new work. And so each of the venues, SF MoMA, Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and ultimately the final location at the museum, at the Whitney, he created new works. So 957 was indeed a new work created specifically for that exhibition. It had never been installed previously. So this is the diagram for 957. Again, you see that LeWitt is working in black and white, only giving you references to the lines in 4 directions. And one of the things that I didn't really necessarily dwell on previously, other than to say what the role of the draftspersons were, LeWitt felt very strongly that the draftspersons needed to be thanked and needed to be recognized for their role in creating the work. It wasn't just Sol LeWitt and here's the drawing and the heck with whoever worked on it. He felt that it was a collaborative relationship and ultimately felt that it was important that these individual artists that would install the work be credited, not just in history, but even on the label in a museum context. So he felt that that was also the proof. And one of the things that I wanted to get back to is ultimately, LeWitt was basically creating wall drawings that were ephemeral of nature. There needed to be a system in which how these works were sold, because people were just going to get a piece of paper. So it was like, well, yeah, no, Sol gave me that, here it is. So he, in 1984, when we did the first retrospective in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, Sol formalized the concept. So he created these formal diagrams for each of the works, and anyone who had purchased a work previously, he sent the diagrams and a certificate to, and asked for the original documents to be returned. So he standardized the process because he got to rethink it, as opposed to simply a random letter or here's the plan for it signed by him. And so he felt like there needed to be a good, solid structure. Again, going back to the notion of a musical score, there needed to be a document that was a reliable vehicle going forward. And it could also be seen as the vehicle of transference if somebody were to buy the work. So this is what the certificate of 957 looks like. These were formal documents, and as you can see, it says Wall Drawing 957, form derived from a cube, black pencil, first drawn by Mio St. Clair, first installation, Whitney Museum of American Art, New York, New York, November of 2000. This is ultimately, this is the artwork with the diagram. The realizations on the wall are simply contemporary installations of the idea. So again, like Bach, no way to know who's going to perform it, how good their skills are, but this is the score. And ultimately, if people respect the underlying concepts of the work, the draftspersons are going to do their best to install it properly. So Sol also felt like if you lose this, it's no different than if you have a painting destroyed in a fire. So he would not replace certificates. There are other artists that started to use certificates. Some artists' estates will replace them. Sol made a very specific decision not to, because he said, it's the artwork. If you lose the artwork, you lose the artwork. So here is Wall Drawing 957 as it has been installed in Mass MoCA in 2008. Again, a different size wall. No way, no comparison to what it looked like the first time. Every time it's reinstalled, you go back to that, to that diagram, and that's the key. That grid is based on the dimension of the wall, and that form has to have those relationships to the dimensions of the wall. So the wall could be drastically bigger, it could be smaller. And ultimately, the form would still look the same, it would just have different dimensions. Which brings us to how it is installed now, as it was installed in 2022. So the person who came to install it from the estate is a studio-trained draftsperson, and she met Sol in the last year of his life, but at this point in time, almost all of the individual artists that work on Sol's work as a lead. So the system is such that if there's a drawing to be installed somewhere, a person who's been trained either by myself or one of the other previous generations of drafters goes to the local institution or collector and works with local artists. It was also something Sol felt very strongly about. He wanted to involve other people's hands. So, I've installed artworks in places where I didn't speak the language with the artists that I was working with. So it's sort of a funny proof of the idea that ultimately if you have this score to reference, that the work is repeatable, even if you don't speak the same language. So here's a detail. And as you can imagine, when Sol first drew these, they drew them one line at a time. Very, very tedious. Ultimately, we came up with a system of trial and error, and we came up to the point where we draw 3 lines at a time. It's not drastically faster, but it's faster and a little bit more reliable. And that is also something that will evolve over time. The materials that LeWitt used in his work were what we always thought of as common, readily available. When 1968, there was no such thing as a place where you couldn't get a 6H pencil. Nowadays, it's a little bit more complex. The inks that we used in the original ink drawings were inks that were created primarily for architects to do architectural rendering. While Sol was alive, the company that made the inks that we used stopped making them because architects started working with computers. So initially, we approached Pelican Ink and said, you know, we'd like to buy some ink. And they said, well, we'll make you a batch of ink, and I forget what the exact volume was, but it was in the hundreds of gallons that they needed to buy. We went through all those inks over a period of time. We went back to Pelican to have them manufacture more. Pelican said, we just took the machines apart. We don't make ink anymore like that. So while LeWitt was alive, he was like, oh, I have to deal with this idea. The materials that I'm using, which I thought were commonplace and readily available everywhere, may change over time. So while he was alive, we in the studio basically worked with pigments and a conservator and came up with a facsimile for the inks that we were originally using, now using acrylic pigments, water, and gloss varnish. The same holds true with the colored leads that were used. They are manufactured, and we have them, Koh-i-Noor, who makes wooden pencils that use those leads, we simply have them pull the leads before they get put into the wooden casings. And that's it. So I'm happy to take any questions.
First one, oh, thank you. This idea of the artist creating a score and then it being executed. Composer and musician executing it, Sol, the artist, and then the draftsman. The difference that I see, though, is that Sol treated his original work as a work of art, whereas the composer ends up having to publish a piece that then is readily available for anybody to play however they wish. Can you talk a little bit about that difference?
It's something that came up in Sol's lifetime, obviously, because people, for example, the first catalog raisonné that was published in 1984 from the Stedelijk, Sol was given the opportunity to do a catalog for this retrospective, and rather than make a catalog of just the works that were in the exhibition, he made a catalog literally of all the wall drawings from number 1 up until 300 something from that existed in 1984. It had the diagram for the drawing, it had what the materials were, it had the mixtures for the inks, it had all the information about the pens and pencils that we used. It was all there. And somebody said, well, you're giving away your work. And he said, no, they didn't buy it. And if they do it, it's no different than if you're classically trained in an art school, maybe not so much anymore, but you would go into a museum and you'd make a copy painting. And LeWitt, I didn't get into all of what Sol wrote about the draftspersons, but at one point he said, because also, when the first time you do one of these drawings, you get, people get really excited and say, I worked on it, and I worked on that section, and it's like, that is essentially negation of his idea. He said, once the drafter tries to identify it as something that they've done, it becomes their work, and it's no longer his. It's that person's variant of it. So Sol said, yeah, somebody can follow these instructions, and maybe they'll do a good job, maybe even better job. but it won't be theirs. It'll simply be a copy painting or parody. You know, where that ends up in the world of appropriation, etc., not for me to decide. But ultimately, you know, the system has worked very well. The institutions and the collectors that own Sol's work respect the underlying context of ownership and are always very careful about it. We have, on only a few occasions have we had circumstances where somebody in a country that will remain unnamed basically said they were having a Sol LeWitt exhibition and they had simply picked drawings from the catalog and tried to do them the way they thought they were supposed to be done. But the Sol and his estate were members of the Artist Rights Society. I don't know if you know more about that or not about it, but it's a way of protecting your work and copyright. And LeWitt wasn't interested in you know, like making money off of the copyright. He just didn't want the work to be misused. So in this particular instance, it's an international organization, and simply you know, the lawyers called and had it removed. So yeah, there is that notion, and it always comes up. NFTs, you know, also this is, you know, if I get one more phone call about, oh, how do you think about NFTs relative to Sol's work? Because it's often identified as he was one of the first artists that was basically selling something that sort of didn't exist.
So my second observation is, I think you mentioned piece number 1 was made in 1968.
Yeah.
In 1964, the composer Terry Riley composed a piece called In C.
Mm-hmm.
And traditional scores are very precise,
Right.
and very much whoever plays it is going to be a close approximation of what it ends up sounding like with feeling or interpretation. In C is quite a bit different because it actually reminds me of a Sol LeWitt piece because it was very much, these are the blocks you have and how you execute them are somewhat up to the musician. Did Sol know of Riley?
Yes.
Were they contemporaries? Did they communicate?
Sol knew Terry Riley, but he was very close with Steve Reich and with Philip Glass, and did collaborations with them both. Actually, Sol traded a wall drawing to Steve Reich for drumming piece, for the score of the drumming piece. So I mean that it was always part of his. I mean, LeWitt obsession with music. There was an exhibition of just his collection of music. The catalog alone is just sort of this phenomenal. I mean, it's actually probably online if you would search it. I mean, he literally, everything that he did was very systematic. And so music always was this, there was, some artists have, you know, silence in their studios. In Sol's studio, there was never silence. And when we do drawings, other than sometimes in public venues like this, we're, you know, whoever's on the crew, we get, you know, somebody's playing something. So there's always, it's always been a big part of the work. But I do understand, and I don't know if you remember the drawing from Zug, that's an example of where Sol says, well, you start here, and where it goes, I got no idea. So yes, that crossover is there. And there's other drawings where Sol also said, you know, I allow the draftsperson to make decisions, but I only give them 4 things to work with. So there's lines, so, you know, I would be remiss to remember the exact text of it. It's basically on a black wall with a 6-inch grid on the wall, and lines from the corners and the midpoints are drawn in white crayon to points on the grid. The draftsperson gets to make the decision on how many and which points they go to. But you only get a black wall, you only get 6-inch grid, you only get white crayon lines. So it's like people say, oh, you know, you can do whatever you want. And it's like, yeah, but you only got 3 things to work with. So, yeah.
In your opinion, how have the events of the Cold War, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and of those of the early 2000s, like 9/11, influenced Sol LeWitt's work?
Well, for starters, although the work seemingly is not political visually, the work is extremely political. He was basically saying this system that art is marketed in, how it's created is something that I'm rejecting. So this was one of my earlier points about him making artist books and doing plans for things that could go. We did an exhibition in Poland before the wall came down, but none of us went. But Sol sent a letter, and the works were installed. And he was also very outspoken. He was Jewish, so it was politics were something that he did care about immensely. He often helped underwrite defense funds for artists that were involved in political acts related to what was going on at any given point in time. So I don't know if you know Dred Scott's work, where it was a piece that you basically had to walk on an American flag to experience what the work was. And of course it ended up, going to, the piece got censored. And so several artists like Sol basically underwrote his legal defense fund. And ultimately the courts ruled in Dred Scott's favor. Sol was also in an exhibition an early work of his, it was an exhibition of Robert It was a photography exhibition, and it was Robert Mapplethorpe's work. And of course, at this point in time, decades ago, when censorship was considerably, well, maybe it's not less now. I'm not sure anymore. That's personal. That's not, his position necessarily. Where Robert Mapplethorpe's work was censored, and Sol pulled his work from the exhibition. So politics were always there. Now I think.
All right. I was wondering about when someone buys the piece of paper.
Yeah.
Okay, so they can decide where they'd like to execute that drawing or have it executed?
Yes.
All right, that's totally up to them, but they can only have one drawing up at the same time?
Yes, so this is also something that came up in Sol's lifetime, where works ended up, going into museum collections or going into a private collector. And then so I don't know how long 957 will stay up. Some of Sol's pieces were installed in the 80s and are still up. And so it came up where somebody said, well, we really want to borrow this drawing from this institution for an exhibition. Do you have to paint out the first one? And Sol said, oh, well, that's a little bit, harsh on the owner. There are economics involved in installing the work. It's physical labor. People get paid. It takes time. And so he said, as long as it's an exhibition and it has a stated duration of a start and an end date, the work could be loaned as an exhibition copy, which is not an unusual thing. So there are other instances where where facsimiles are made because the original piece might be too delicate to travel. So it plays a little bit into that system, where he said, yes, if it's an exhibition, has a start and an end date, it can be installed as a loan, but only for an exhibition, and the original work doesn't have to be destroyed. But if you own the work and you want it up in two places semi-permanently, he wouldn't allow it. So part of what I do is my job. It doesn't happen so much with institutions, but it does happen with collectors, where somebody sells their house or they have a second home and they like Sol's piece and they want to have it up in both places.
Yeah.
And I basically say I need to see a photograph of the piece destroyed. So it has to be painted out. So I keep records of all that. Uh-huh. And that is one of the things that's always, there's some of the, one of the ways that I first got interested in Sol was when I was a student. He was part of this exhibition in Chicago at the Art Institute, and he had done a wall drawing, and at the end of the exhibition, the walls got chopped up and tossed into a dumpster, and I was like, oh. And I would walk by on my way to class, and and it was like, that was just in the museum. I got to meet this guy. So, but there are people who have bought Sol's work and have never installed it. I mean, it's really up to the owner as to what they want to do. And but the system is very reliable, and it's worked very well for the last. Sol passed away in 2007, and we have done literally hundreds and hundreds of installations since he passed away, and it always sort of filters through my desk goes through the estates. So people reach out and say, we'd like to install this, and it's usually a fairly straightforward, we ask for a photograph of the wall so I know what the architecture looks like and the dimensions. And then we go from there. Yeah. Because, again, Sol had no way of knowing, so that's the thing. When a collector buys the work, they get the certificate and the diagram. They don't get the installation because he had no way of knowing where it was going to be, how big it was going to be. So the installation was always a separate aspect of cost. So, that was also sort of the underlying politic. It's like, oh, I buy this and the artist doesn't do it, and I got to pay somebody else to do it. So there was always these questionings of the economics of the system. And as no offense to other artists that work in a more traditional event, people say sometimes, oh, I have to pay, some local artist to install the work, and somebody has to come from, Berlin or New York or wherever to install the work. And I'm like, yeah, they're artists, they get paid by the day. They're independently, they're not on the, they're workers. And Sol felt that people needed to be paid for their work. And I said, but you're not paying for a crate. You're not paying for the insurance to move it. You're not paying for the truck. So, let's reassess what's involved economically.
Yeah. Can I ask one more?
Sure.
Quick one? Just what the idea of these, variations on cube themed drawings, but all done in a isometric style rather than, like you look at them and you're fighting to, you want to see the perspective and you don't. And why was he so big on that?
He felt it was the best way to present the form and yet not try to create a landscape environment for it to exist in, because he wanted them to be basically free of the background. He was very adamant about, so most artworks have a focal point, be it a painting or, Sol felt very strongly that the work should be seen all at once and uniform. So if he grounded it, it would give you a different sort of focus. So he said, oh, I don't want to, you could create this form in a more traditional manner, but he wanted you to have a sense of it. And also he was trained as a draftsperson. So, again, there are drawings where you describe where the text of the drawing is, people don't necessarily teach mechanical drawing that way anymore, but it used to be that you would be given a set of dimensions and you had no idea what you were drawing. It was just, you would, like a 45-degree angle, 2 inches long, et cetera, a curve by this many, a radius of this. And so Sol played with some of those things where he literally has instructions on the location of a square. And it's, the texts are dense beyond comprehension and they're hysterical. And when somebody asked him, what are these about? He said, well, I wanted to think of the most complicated way to describe the simplest thing. So there was a very dry sense of humor. And I didn't get into that because I'm trying to deal with this particular aspect of his work. But there's a lot of Sol's work that was simply based on language where you have no idea what you're doing until it gets drawn. Anybody else?
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your talk. This is really interesting.
Well, thank you.
My question is that there was a collaboration between Lucinda Childs, Philip Glass, and Sol LeWitt.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you have any insight. In other words, did the three artists know each other?
Yes.
Or was there someone else that said, I got, dance, music, we got to get in the mix?
No, they were all intimate friends, long-standing intimate friends. Sol did the visuals for the piece. And it's a film which is, an aspect of Sol's work was about if you know Muybridge's photographs of animal locomotion, it was based on a grid with either a person or an animal moving through space and time. And there's a clue into LeWitt's work there. And So what he did with Lucinda's piece was basically do these visual delays of the dancer's movement. And it has something to do with Muybridge.
Thank you.
I'm impressed by the physical requirements of putting those marks on the wall. I can't imagine how somebody works on it day after day and can maintain the same touch, stay in the same, I imagine, mood, have the same amount of coffee ahead of time.
There are drawings that, such as that, and some of the last works that he did where they're called scribble drawings, where you basically scribble all day long. And it's, again, based on tonalities of 0 to 6, 6 being black, white, 0 being white. And so it would be, yet again, a diagram would indicate what value was assigned to those. But literally, you would scribble for 8 hours a day. And it's based on the idea that it's random because everybody, I mean, I'm sure at some point you doodled on a piece of paper and you realize that you often repeat the same pattern. So imagine the mindset that's required to negate. It's sort of the equivalent of, tapping your head and rubbing your stomach at the same time and trying to draw. So we developed systems of moving people around. So not so much in the drawing series piece because it does require a very skilled hand. I mean, those drawings are probably the most sophisticated physically and mentally to do. But there are other the ink drawings require you to move incredibly fast. So if you would look into Sol's work, so there is I'm not marketing anything, there's a free app that was developed by Microsoft and it's available on Apple and both Android, and it's simply Sol's catalog raisonné in a smaller form, and it's free. And it gives you access to basically all the wall drawings. And so some of these drawings are hundreds of feet long. I mean, there's a drawing in Springfield, Massachusetts that you can't see the beginning of it from the end. You can't perceive you can only experience the piece by walking through the space because it's a circular room, an exterior of a courtroom. So there are drawings that, drawings that crews of 20 have worked on for, 8 weeks, 6 days a week. And then there are drawings that literally, one of my favorite drawings is a very small crayon drawing. It's a 12-inch square, and it was an earlier work where LeWitt said, "Oh, I have this idea," because he often played with the math of things. So the concept was a kid's pack of 12 Crayola crayons, and you make a 12-inch square, and you scribble with each crayon until it's completely gone. And it just becomes this incredibly luscious surface. And I was like, "Sol, well, what order do I do it in?" He said, "Well, whatever the last color is, that's what it's going to be." So again, he trusted the intrinsic underlying idea, and it was always going to have its own context. And to the point about labor, there's a drawing where you work for 4 hours for 4 days, drawing for, so he played a lot with some of those ideas of what labor is and what's involved. There's a drawing where you drew the drawing, and as soon as it's done, you paint it out because he was trying to make a point. I mean, those tend to be the earlier works because that's when he was really questioning things, and then he, embraced other materials and other ideas. Even the most, some of the more vibrant works that are in color, he still was only working with primaries and secondaries. The ink drawings are all based on primaries, red, yellow, blue, and gray inks. All the color combinations are still only coming from those combinations. So there was always this labor and system approach. But he often was like, "Oh, well, this isn't going to be the easiest job." So there are draftspersons who are really good at some drawings, and really not, that I don't send to do other ones because it's like, at one point, Sol was interviewed. There's a really good documentary that was produced by the Checkerboard Foundation when we did the retrospective. And Gary Garles, who was the curator at the time at SF MoMA, interviewed Sol. And he said, well, you know, the draftspersons, you know, some of them have very specific skills. And he said, yeah, well, you want to have the best person to do the job. He said it would still be a LeWitt. He said, and as an example, he said, well, my niece is studying piano. Her version of Bach variations, the Goldberg variations, really not the same as Glenn Gould's, but it's still Bach. So he did understand that, and I do. I mean, it is simply there are things that some people are better at, and obviously the more you practice it, like a musician, the better you get. So there are people who I count on more for doing certain kinds of drawings. And there are people, like the woman who came, Lacey, who came to work on this drawing, she's very good at standing and concentrating. Running around on scaffold, maybe not as much. So, you know, you again, I try to get people trained to the best of their ability and try to get them to enjoy their skills as much as possible.
So I sort of have a follow-up question to that. Do you have like a catalog or documentation of different pieces that have been done by different artists or draftsmen over time? And have they, if so, has it been studied, and did that impact LeWitt's thinking around this type of, you know, this type of work, or even yours, I guess now?
He often, if it was a new piece, he would often show up midstream, sort of speaking, you know, after we got started, and he'd come at the end to see what it looked like. But if it was a work that he had already, if had been created, like a traveling exhibition, he had no interest whatsoever in seeing it installed in a new. He'd say, just send me pictures of it. The documentation that I made, so in a traditional archive, everything that's produced in that person's lifetime gets locked in time, and it stays static. And with Sol's archive, every contemporary installation gets added to the documentation of the original wall drawing. So it's a digital archive. There are folders. So wall drawing number 1 hasn't been installed, not hundreds of times, but dozens of times. So every time that it's been installed, there's a new photograph of it and all the documentation related to that. But Sol wasn't particularly interested in that. I mean, there was an exhibition that I worked on that was traveling, and it was in 5 different venues. And it was, you know, always the same piece, but in every place it looked a little bit different just because the dimensions changed or the placement changed. So Sol accepted that, but there was just simply more proof that the idea worked. So yes, there is documentation, and there is a digital catalog raisonné, which is only by subscription. You know, it's just the nature of how things are published nowadays. And it is audited every year, so when we first released it, it had all the works as they were installed. So if it had been installed in multiple places, there was a photograph of it in each of the venues that it was installed at. And then if it's been installed subsequently to the original publication, that information is added to it once a year. So it's available, but it is, I say, you know, some universities have it as a library subscription because it's Cahiers d'Art out of Europe, and it's a nonprofit wing of their publishing, but they're doing digital artist catalogs. Sol wanted to do a book form, and it's just never been able to get to that point physically. Anybody else? Thank you.